Hi folks, Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I am doing yet another installment of the Freelancer Q&A series that I do on this live stream and also the YouTube channel, where this gets published a little bit later after I record it. Trying a different thing with my mic here, having it like more straight on. I'm hoping that results in more consistent volume. I realize like on meetings, I don't do this because I have another monitor over here, and it would be right in my line of sight, but when I'm recording this stream, I'm not looking into that monitor. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. Anyway, that is not super germane. It's just a meta note. The actual question this week is, how did you land on your niche? And this is one directed at me. Now on this channel, I haven't done a lot of, so over the years, a lot of readers would write in asking a lot of different kinds of questions, some of which were about me and my experience and so on. I haven't done a lot of this here, just because I don't know if it's always like completely relevant to all of the audience, especially if you're subscribing without having like followed me over the years or knowing much about who I am. But I think this one is sort of relevant, as I've been answering a lot of older reader questions about like how to find a niche as a freelancer and so on. So this is more of like a field study in when I was consulting and working as an indie. I had a niche. How did I go about finding it? So I'm kind of making an exception there under the assumption that the information will be generally relevant to the channel. So please bear with me. So the question in the general sense is, how did you, me, Eric, land on your niche? The actual phrasing of this question is, knowing the tools and technologies that you do, I'm sure you've had access to specialize in a wide variety of niches. How did you land on the ones that you did? Were they based on interest, market relevance, or some combination of both? And so hopefully you can see why I think this is relevant to the channel, because me and how I came to the niche that I did, such as it was, would be kind of a case study of those of you out there. It's like one person's example, and one that I might argue is at least semi-successful, although not completely. And I'll get into why I say that here in a moment. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me and my background, currently I am the CEO of a business, a digital marketing business, as it were. But before I did that, I was a software engineer for a lot of years, working as a salaried software engineer. And then eventually I kind of worked my way up that org chart until my last salaried position was as a CIO. From there, I went off on my own and started doing freelance programming and some consulting, a kind of mix of stuff. And over the course of, I guess, 7 years that I did that, the boundaries are a little fuzzy because I didn't stop consulting when I started Hit Subscribe with my wife 6 years ago. So roughly about 7 years, I would say I was doing consulting in the software engineering space, let's call it. Initially, a lot of like freelance programming and consulting at the firm where I was a CIO after I had left for a while. But it kind of evolved gradually into a management consulting practice. So that's my background in broad strokes. And I think it's relevant because this is being asked of me personally. So at the time when this question was asked, I want to say it was 2 or 3 years ago. That was about when I had really hung up consulting. I want to say, so my wife and I started Hit Subscribe in 2017, and the goal of that was originally for her to run that business. We were turning me writing blog posts in my spare time while I was traveling and at hotels. The goal was to turn that into a small like content business that she would run with potentially a stable of authors and editors. Now, it didn't go that way because the demand for this business really took off, but that was the initial goal in the beginning, which I mention because in 2017, 2018, 2019, I was in some senses only really doing Hit Subscribe as one of my ventures in a part-time fashion. And in those years, I was still taking on consulting gigs. So when this question was asked was towards the end of when I was doing any more consulting gigs. And by this time, I would argue that I had evolved into a fairly specific kind of practice that I had. And this is the scenario, I guess, in which I'm being asked this question. So at the time, I was a consultant. How did I pick my niche? And I guess let me explain what I would view as my niche around this time. I would have, or I did view it as essentially using data from within an organization, usually in the form of their source code, but it could have been other things, using data that I would glean from within an organization to help engineering executives or people in the executive or in the org chart of the engineering group, usually executives, senior leadership. I would help them make decisions. So, for instance, things that I helped about, or I helped them arrive at decisions about, would often be related to code bases, like should we retire this code base? Should we evolve it to a more modern programming language? If we're going to acquire this organization, does our staff have the right skill set to take on this application portfolio? A lot of things of that nature. Usually I was finding myself in enterprises, although not always, and I was helping people, executives typically, make difficult decisions about how to go forward. And then sometimes it would be stuff like, building org charts or helping somebody understand why their agile transformation was getting off the rails. So as you might infer, if you've been watching this channel, this isn't the most tightly buttoned up niche you could imagine. So I guess what I'm getting at is I want to, before I get into how I arrived at this, I want to be fully self-aware as to whether I had really arrived at a good niche or not in terms of the way that I've defined it on this channel. And I'll throw up a video here where I've talked about, for instance, niching versus positioning, and other topics here. So just to recap, I think of a niche as identifying a cohesive group of people that need something in common. So a niche is a need, it's an unmet demand in the market, versus your positioning is, why am I uniquely skilled or uniquely suited to fill this niche? So a niche is about them. It's about your buyers. Your positioning and how you do things is about you, your secret sauce. So I think of like a specialty positioning, et cetera, is about you. The niche is about the buyers. So had I identified a good niche or really a niche at all? And I would say that's pretty mixed. In some senses, you could say yes. If I had to go back and wear rose-colored glasses and think of myself as a savvy identifier of niches at the time, I would have said the niche was executives that were facing a difficult decision and they wanted a bulletproof way to make that decision. And I think that's a decent niche in terms of like being aware of my buyer. And I was at the time. So here's a little, interesting insight about senior management and executives and so on. A lot of times it's really lonely at the top. And I don't mean that as in like, oh, there's nobody around to like sip my whiskey with or whatever, but more you're making decisions that affect a lot of people. And usually the way that organizations are structured, you're kind of out on a limb making those decisions and living with the ramifications of those. So one of the things that can be deeply reassuring when making a decision like that is to bring somebody in who works with you on it and to give you something to point to where you say, even if the outcome of what I decided wasn't what I had hoped for, the decision-making rationale was sound. So for instance, for me to go in working with some of my clients, if I would go in and size up their code base using static analysis and say, okay, you have a lot of dependency snarl, you're taking a lot of dependencies on outdated technologies that are being sunset and have vulnerabilities. And so I were to build this white paper, which was typically the deliverable I would have to back up the decision. So I would write this white paper, I would lay it out, and I would go through an executive deck explaining it. Now, if you're that the executive to whom I'm presenting this, you now have a white paper justifying this decision that you've made. And I like to think that I did a pretty good job of explaining these things coherently and building a nice data-driven case. So as an executive, if you are later responsible for this decision, especially in the event that the outcome ultimately wasn't great, you can go back and say, we had a pretty good piece of rationale for doing this. It's not just, oh, well, I shot from the hip and this is what I was feeling and I just made an arbitrary decision. So anyway, I think that what I had there was a good niche in that a lot of executive decision makers are looking to really button up the rationale for decisions that they make. So it's a a cohesive set of people and they have a certain need and it's not super well filled, I mean, I guess you can hire, and probably organizations do hire somebody like a McKinsey or a PwC or whoever to come in and fill that role. And then they can say like, well, McKinsey told me to do it. But at any rate, so in that sense, I think it was a decent niche. Like I had a coherent buyer theory, but if I look back on it, I actually, with a friend of mine, I tried to start a business. His background was in marketing, and this would have been in 2017. And we did a few engagements under this umbrella that we called code-based analytics. I remember we had an on-site with a university. So we were trying to figure out how to turn me getting business via word of mouth and, you know, maybe occasionally people finding me through content that I created. We were trying to turn that into a more scalable business. And the marketing and sales for it was always pretty difficult, because how do you really market like, oh, I can help you make a decision? I mean, there was enough there to pay the bills, but it was usually that executive A would say, oh, you know, I have this tough decision coming up, and they would happen to know executive B that I had worked with and said, you know who you ought to call. And I could have gone on making a living like this, but this didn't trigger Rolodex moments. So if I were to explain to people, and my friend and I tried to do this, like as we were trying to do a little bit of market research and maybe experiment with sales and outreach tactics, you know, I help executives make tough decisions. I mean, you know, if you keep it vague enough that it's understandable, then it doesn't really land. It sounds kind of wishy-washy. But if I were to get a lot more specific, like I go in and I use a series of static analyzers to turn your code into data. And then I match that against a corpus of data that I built on open source and proprietary code bases over the course of my travels to size up how you're doing and what your code base is like. I mean, if I'm telling anybody, like probably half of you just spaced out as I was saying that, and I was trying to keep it relatively brief. So imagine you're trying to, like, you know, be out at networking events or venues or hand out business cards. You're going to lose people if you get specific. So we never really did get into the, I guess, sweet spot of how to market that. And I think a lot of times with a good niche, at least your buyers will instantly grok the value that you're bringing to the table. And we never really got there. So, that was, I guess, my story, and I'm teeing it all up. I want to tell in the end how I arrived at this, because I think it's important to understand that I am not setting this up as I came up with this great niche and you should try to mimic me heuristically to get to success. I would argue that there was enough of a need and I traded on enough of a reputation to have a very lucrative consulting practice, but I don't think I ever really did this well enough that you should treat me as a model for it. Even as I was giving advice, you know, and kind of like do as I say, not as I do fashion about niches. I don't know that I ever achieved the pinnacle of this. In some ways, since then, with Hit Subscribe, identifying market segments. And by the way, I've gotten quite an education in marketing over the last 6 years by running a marketing business. So I think that I could now go back and give past me and my friend from 4 or 5 years ago good advice on how to tighten that up. But at the time, I really hadn't. And actually, I guess speaking of which, if I could go back and give that advice, you know, in framing here for you folks listening, the thing that I would probably say is that it would have been focusing less on me and what I did. So like static code analysis and that stuff that I was talking about. And it would have been focusing more on these buyers and probably detecting a pattern in them. So executive that's about to make a difficult decision, sure, that's true, but it's too vague and it doesn't trigger that Rolodex moment. So I think what we would have had to do is kind of go all in on one or two decisions that they were making or situations that they were in. So offhand, I would have said, you know, stop it with the decisions and static code analysis. And instead, you know, what's a common moment for an executive in a software organization? One of those things might be, you're coming in or thinking of coming in as a, say, CIO of a large organization, or maybe you're going to take a promotion. So something around that moment where you're coming into the business and you want to get your bearings. That could be something like if you're a new hire, you deploy us to come in, size up the code base, and do something like, you know, give you a general audit so you understand what your application portfolio looks like. Or maybe it would be something like, bring us in and we'll tell you if you are if you have the right staff to meet your goals. So things that were more specific like that, executive has just been hired, or you're about to be audited, or you're about to acquire another business. And we did nibble at things like this, by the way. We actually, one of the last things we did before deciding that it was going to be too hard to make this work was look at helping out with M&A, so mergers and acquisitions. So we were looking at helping buyers of companies assess the code base portfolios of the targets of acquisition. And actually, I won't get into it now, but there was a really fascinating reason that it didn't work that has to do with the just astonishing lack of due diligence that goes into acquisitions of software. But that's a tale for beers or another video or something. Anyway, it would have been something like that. Like if I could go back and do it over, we would have focused the entire practice on a moment like, you're about to acquire a code base from another company, or CIO is just hired and wants to know if they have the right staff or something like that. So we would have picked out, at least in the early going, before maybe establishing multiple practices or lines of business or offerings, it would have been to pick out one decision that we could do really well. And I think that would have been a good niche because, coming in as an executive to a new organization with, hundreds or thousands of people reporting into you and wanting to know what you've got in terms of the code base, that's a real genuine need, and it's a specific situation. And if we had done a couple of those, you become like the only person in the world or practice in the world that's doing that specific thing. So I think it could have been a good niche. I don't think I ever quite got it to that point. So with all of that context set up, I guess, now I think maybe it's interesting to think about how I got into it, just so that you understand, maybe parts of this are worth mimicking, but not altogether. So the way that I got into doing this was, I would say, both iterative and opportunistic. When I left my role as a CIO, at first, I did a little bit of freelance application development, and then I also came in with a firm that I would do a bunch of subcontracting for over the course of a few years. But the first gig I had was I went out to, it was at Ford, and I had I forget what they were calling it, but basically I came in to help developers there learn test-driven development and pair programming, extreme programming practices. And this was a lot of fun because I had just come from running a department with all the HR and all the stuff that goes with having reports. And it was kind of like this little vacation. Like I was traveling every week and I got to like work on the mentorship aspects of this, like teaching people to code, but without like all the, baggage that comes with having an organization reporting into you. So that was a good time. And I forget exactly how it went, but over the course of a year or so, in doing a little bit of consulting in different places, I wound up, maybe it was still at Ford, I can't remember, but I wound up advising in a situation where a company was looking to have metrics, I guess, about the different departments and how they were doing, or like different teams of developers and how they were doing. So I started to think about, how would you assess not the developers themselves? I didn't really want to get into the business of like Dilbert-esque, utilization metrics or whatever, but to start to think about, what should we be looking for in code bases? So I started to think about composite code metrics and different ways to treat code bases as data. And I think that was the real seed for this practice. The next thing that I remember happening was somebody calling and asking, I guess they probably knew I was doing some of this work, if I could advise on like sizing up a code base. So I put together kind of a, I think calling it like a lightweight SOP would be generous, but a way to like assess a code base that wasn't just running a static analyzer and saying, hey, this thing thinks you suck. Like I did a very small version of this, and it was successful. And somebody who noticed that asked me to do another one, and it kind of snowballed from there. So gradually over the course of time, I became more interested in that work. I saw that there was a demand for it. And I saw that it, framed in the right way, tended to like attract interest up the org chart. So it wasn't long before it went from I would be presenting my findings to like a dev manager or director to. Pretty soon it was executives and CEO or even the board of directors in some cases. So I noticed the ascent up the org chart of who was interested in this. I iteratively found more and more opportunities, and then I refined my SOPs and my work product and what I was doing, and really just kind of kept an eye open for opportunities as I was going along and was receptive. So if there's one thing I think you could learn from me, if I had to pick, a single thing, it would be when you're doing this, when you're trying to iterate your way towards filling some kind of niche and doing it in a specialized way, you're not going to sit down and have a whiteboard in front of you and brainstorm and come up with the perfect thing. What you're going to wind up coming up with is maybe a decent starting point, and you're going to have to iterate through, I would say, some rounds of refinement. And that refinement isn't going to be just in your head. You're going to have to go out there and do a few engagements and see how they go, get a few reps, and then refine what you're doing. And I would definitely sprinkle in as much market research as you can possibly do. So in addition to taking on a gig, seeing how it goes, taking on a similar gig, etc., the whole time be putting out feelers, ask the different stakeholders in what you're doing, what kind of other things they would want, or what they think of this. Ask anybody in your network that is similar to the stakeholders that you're working with, like, hey, would you be interested in something like this? Oh no, what if I did this and this instead? And tee that up, not in a way where you're trying to pitch them, but just to say like, hey, I was doing a similar project for another director in your type of work. And I'm not trying to sell this to you. I don't have a thing to sell right now at the moment, but I'm just curious, is there a practice here for me? Like, would you also pay for this? So you want to be asking a lot of questions like that. And I think that's really probably where I would leave it. Like, so the way I came to do what I was doing circa 2019 or 2020, when I was kind of at the end of the road, I think it was in 2020 or 2021 that I officially dissolved Dead Tech as an LLC, and I stopped doing consulting and started referring out anybody who was still coming to me about that. But where I left that, where I wound up, it was iterative almost the entire time until, gosh, I can't remember the years anymore, but 2018. So maybe 5 years after I went off on my own, my friend and I started trying to think about what a practice would look like. There was a lot of time where I was just kind of bouncing around, refining in sort of passive fashion based on the work that I would get, what this would look like. It was not before 5 years that we sat down and started to even think about like, okay, what if we were going to make this a deliberate thing and we were going to market and sell it and scale it? So I guess, yeah, that would be a lesson is, or at least if you're looking at me as an example of, I mean, I paid the bills, I made a nice living doing it. So I guess I could be a decent example. And the lesson there would be iteratively, opportunistically, always asking lots of questions, always doing market research, always being open to doing something that was a little bit different than I had done before. And, now that I think of it, if I were going to give you one last piece of advice, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. So if somebody asks you to do something and it's out of your wheelhouse or comfort zone, but it seems interesting and promising, instead of saying no because you don't know how to do it, and instead of saying, okay, but I'm going to charge you, $150 an hour, even though I don't know what I'm doing because I'm worried that I'm not going to make money on this, be willing to do some things at a potential loss, or be willing to do some things that aren't very profitable so that you can learn on the job, but in a way that doesn't put the client at risk, which means that the client will feel good about it. So I did a lot of extra elbow grease at times, refining my own work product when it came to these types of analysis and assessments, where I probably would veer into unprofitable territory from time to time. But once I understood enough about how to do it, the next one wouldn't be unprofitable, it would be more profitable. And being willing to take a little bit of a short-term haircut to do something to get experience, I think is an underrated way to refine your offering and what you're doing, and gain some market experience and understanding, as well as, that first testimonial so you can sell another one of these to the next person. So, I guess that's the story. Again, to go back, how did I land on my niche? You might philosophically say that I didn't. I was constantly iterating and refining, even right till the end. But in as much as I did land on it, it was the polar opposite of sitting down and thinking, like, what should I do? It was just iteratively taking on work that seemed interesting in ways where I felt I was adding more and more value. It was very organic and incremental, iterative, opportunistic. So I hope that's at least passingly interesting and helpful. And yeah, I will catch you all next time.